Welcome to episode 18 of the Revolution podcast, where I, your host Ryan, sit down with industry experts to discuss the latest trends in e-mobility, clean tech, and the future of transportation. Today I'm joined by Fiona Howarth, CEO of Octopus Electric Vehicles, an electric vehicle leasing company who specialize in offering personal, business, or salary sacrifice leasing schemes, as well as EV charging and renewable energy tariffs. Into the episode we go. Thank you for joining the podcast, Fiona. Before we dive into Octopus Electric Vehicles, it would be great to learn about your background and your journey to date.
Yeah, sure. So interestingly, I've actually been intrigued and fascinated by the future of cars and sustainability since I was a teenager. So there's a physics teacher at school that explained to me that we were burning all these fossil fuels to generate electricity and to get around in our cars, but they were finite and they were going to run out and they were bad for the environment. But there was an alternative, which was renewable energy. And I remember this kind of conversation I had with him, which is like, well, that sounds good. It's better for the environment. It runs on the sun or the wind. You know, why are we not using that today to power our homes and power our cars? And he said, well, it's expensive and there's already this existing industry that's all built up around fossil fuels. So you can't just switch over. And I was like, well, we're going to have to at some point. Even if it's not for environmental reasons, we'll have to switch over because we're going to run out of them. So I started looking into it at the time, and I got really interested in electric cars. Obviously, the range was a challenge at that point. There weren't really many available. And then I spoke to some other people. I did engineering. When I was at university, somebody said, it's not going to be electric cars, Fiona. It's going to be fuel cell cars, hydrogen cars. So I got into hydrogen, and I worked for BMW for a bit, developing their kind of hydrogen car. And then I went around the world actually investigating it. And at the time, there were a lot of technical challenges. And there's a real challenge with hydrogen around what comes first, the car or the infrastructure to be able to fill the cars up. And of course, with electricity is everywhere. So that what comes first question has already been answered actually for the most part in electricity. Sure, we've got to put chargers in the ground. But actually, there's electricity to many, many buildings and locations already. So actually, for electric cars, you've got a real head start. And so at that point, it was kind of early 2000s. EVs were far away. Fuel cell cars and hydrogen cars were even further away. And actually, I get really excited about having commercialized technology. So I went to do some other things, stayed in that space and thinking about energy and technology and so forth. Learned a lot around that kind of development in the energy space and how that marries nicely with the EV space. And then came back to it about 4 years ago in 2017 when I had that classic conversation about EVs when somebody was telling me about their Tesla. And I was like, is it any good? Does it go very far? Where can you charge it? And they're like, yes, great. And they were telling me all about it and telling me about the supercharger network. And they said, have you driven one? No, I haven't. And I went and drove a Nissan Leaf, BMW i3 and a Tesla. And I was like, this is it. This is happening. They've come of age. And it was time for me to get back into it. So that's 4 years ago, almost exactly 4 years ago, that I drove those cars and was super excited to get back into it.
Yeah, that's really fascinating because you clearly had an interest in this industry before it was mainstream like today. Even in the last 4 years, I'm sure you've seen massive changes in the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And even so, the cars that were available were limited. So we hosted a pop-up event actually just to see if people were interested. We kind of marketed to a local town and we got the latest EVs that were available that could go over 100 miles on single charge. And those were, I can count them on one hand, the Nissan Leaf, the BMW i3, the Renault Zoe, and then two Teslas. There was the S and the X. The 3 wasn't out yet. And actually, they are all quite unique in their own way. You know, obviously, you've got very, very expensive Teslas there. The i3, fantastic and sustainable, but is quite quirky to look at. And they made a real design statement with it. And there was the all-star Nissan Leaf as well, and the Renault Zoe, which I always thought was the kind of the hidden gem in that group. But there was not many cars, and so it didn't suit that many people. And there's so much nervousness around how far they'd go and so forth. And there weren't many other people driving them at the time for people to ask their questions to or build confidence in. Whereas now it's totally transformed to people seeing EVs on the roads all the time. They see their neighbors have got them. They probably know somebody by now that has an EV that they can go and ask questions about or that they can start to build confidence in. So, you know, there was that time when you'd turn up to that barbecue in the summer and somebody would be showing you maybe the latest iPhone or they'd be showing you their Apple Watch. And then a couple of years ago, it turned out that people were starting to turn up to those barbecues and they were telling people about their electric car. And they were telling people about their smart tariff that we were using to charge up their electric car in the middle of the night. And I remember I started sharing that story in a couple of events, and people would say, yeah, that happened to me at the weekend, actually. This guy he came along in his Tesla and he's telling me all about your tariff. And it's funny because people are talking about it, and the confidence has changed so much, and the attitude and excitement around it. And now there's over 30 models, I think, are available on our website that can meet that standard, whereas, 4 years ago.
I completely agree, and factors such as the cost of ownership and the range of EVs have made them much more accessible to the mass market. I'd also say that whilst in the early days, most EV drivers were people really fascinated by the technology and the innovations, now EVs are actually just a great option for any consumer.
I totally agree. I think the price of batteries came down by about 80% over 5 years, and that totally transformed the amount of battery capacity you can really put into some of these cars. It's continued to drop since. And so that's brought the cost of the vehicles down. And also, I mean, Tesla have really trailblazed in terms of, say, bringing out a couple of those expensive ones, but then bringing out a more affordable version. Now, I know it's still not as low cost as some of the other vehicles that we do see in the market in petrol and diesel terms, but it's a fantastic car in that range that it's at, in that space versus, the kind of BMW 3 Series, for example. And it's fantastic. I think people are becoming smarter around thinking about the whole life cost of these vehicles. So instead of just looking at, say, that upfront cost, also thinking about the running costs and thinking about the servicing and maintenance costs and so forth, which, as you know, is just much lower with electric vehicles than it is for their other petrol and diesel cars. So that, and also all the other manufacturers that have now brought out fantastic vehicles, covering a range of different types of car, as well as having good long range from an electric power perspective as well.
Yeah, and I think this is a good moment to transition to Octopus Electric Vehicles, where you've been the CEO since 2017. Could you give an introduction to your company, as well as touching upon the relationship between Octopus Electric Vehicles and the Octopus Group?
Sure. So at Octopus EV, our mission is to make it as simple as possible for individuals and businesses to make that switch to electric transport. So that covers everything from, how do you identify the great car that you might want to switch into, or maybe it's a van, for example. And so we have independent and impartial experts that know across the range of different cars that can help you identify one that would suit you. And then they can help you think about the charging and the energy tariffs as well. And actually, we have got smart energy tariffs that we've developed in partnership, with Octopus Energy, and have helped facilitate smart charging companies to also connect up with some of those smart tariffs as well, so that we can really unlock low-cost charging for drivers in the middle of the night. For example, when wholesale electricity prices are generally a lot lower than during the day or during peak times. And this is really important, actually, for us to help balance the grid and things as we go forward and more people take electric vehicles and so forth. So we make it as easy as possible with the experts, the cars, the charging and the energy. And specifically on the cars now, we've gone a bit further, which is around that leasing space. We partnered with different leasing companies in the past, but we've actually now set up as a leasing business ourselves, so that we can really specialize in things like salary sacrifice. So in the UK, you can get your electric vehicle by paying for it out of your gross salary. So that means it comes out of your gross salary before income tax and national insurance. And so actually people are saving 30 to 40% typically every month on their electric car costs. And in fact, some people can even save up to about 60%. So this all of a sudden makes it hugely competitive and compelling versus other options on the market. And so not only is it cheaper to run from fuel costs and a servicing maintenance cost, but now the leasing cost is also much lower. And in fact, we can offer that in a bundle with the car and insurance and servicing and maintenance all wrapped in one monthly cost out of your salary. And we found, of course, unsurprisingly, that people really like that. And so we had a lot of interest in that last year, and we were unable to move at the pace to be able to support those customers with the service that we would like. So we've now set ourselves up as a leasing company. We've just launched that under the name Electric Dreams. So you get this Electric Dreams scheme that we can help businesses set up to offer that to their employees. So across the board, we've got, obviously, we're now I think it's a double unicorn. I'm not sure if that technically works, but we are a business that was set up and launched about 5 years ago, almost exactly 5 years ago, as an energy supplier and a tech energy company in the space. So we have the tech that underpins that energy supplier, which means that we can, offer great service, but can also do really cool innovative tariffs, like I was chatting about earlier. But also it's gone further than that in terms of we've now expanded overseas. That platform is now supporting other energy suppliers. We also have now just done a deal so that we are now managing a portfolio, or will be later this year when it finally goes over the line, of managing a portfolio of almost £3 billion worth of renewable energy generation, so wind and solar. So that's super exciting. And then the whole group is working really together basically to help create that smart energy transition. So everything from the generation then through to, just it being supplied in a smart way to your house, through to helping you transition in things like electric vehicles and getting your charge points, etc.
Great. And without knowing too many details myself, it looks like you're really filling a gap in the market. In terms of the leasing element of the business, I find it intriguing because the idea of leasing isn't intrinsically linked to EVs, just like how EVs aren't connected to autonomous vehicles, but are just new technologies that mutually benefit each other while growing at the same time. Leasing is a popular business model nowadays, both for cars, but also for other consumer products. Do you see leasing as the future?
Yeah, I definitely can see that. And particularly what we see is a parallel to like the mobile phone industry. So I don't know if it's the same in the Netherlands, but for example, here in the UK, when you got your mobile phone in the first instance, you used to get it on a 2-year contract. In fact, you probably still do today, but you get it on a 2-year contract partly because 2 years later, there'd be new tech out. There'd be new tech and it would have more storage, more data storage, or it would have better Wi-Fi, it would have a better camera on it, whatever it might be, that you would get that next more improved mobile phone. And actually, that's exactly the kind of development cycle we're seeing in EVs. So all the time, there are new EVs being launched and they're coming out with bigger range. They're coming out with more tech on board. To your point, whether it's autonomous or connected cars, these are tech on wheels now. And that tech is developing very quickly. And so what we do see is that people who really like to have their hands on the latest tech, or they're not quite sure what else might be on the market in a couple of years' time, this enables them to get a car for 2, 3, 4 years, for example, and then actually they can get the latest, greatest tech again and almost upgrade just like you used to with your mobile phone and get a new car in 2, 3, 4 years. This is also fantastic actually for the second-hand market, because in the UK, the second-hand market is 2.5, 3 times as big as the new market. And it's obviously how we'll also help many people switch into electric transport and clean transport. And so actually by this leasing element, by more people taking their electric car on a lease today, those cars then will go into that second-hand market in 2, 3, 4 years from now, helping stimulate that space as well and serving a slightly different customer base. So both of those things work very nicely together.
Yeah, and the mobile phone model is definitely a great comparison. And you could even go as far as saying services like Netflix and Spotify exist for the same reason. It just means the consumer is left with much more flexibility, with the option of upgrading to newer technology without having to invest large sums of money.
It also means that the leasing company in this situation is taking the risk on the value of that vehicle 3 years from now, for example. So obviously, with new tech being launched all the time, it's difficult to know exactly what the value of that vehicle might be in 3 years' time. So it means that you've got a set amount that you pay every month. You hand that car back at the end, you can get your new one, but you aren't left with an asset that you might not know exactly what it's going to be worth because the market's continually changing and evolving.
Yeah, and it's great you touched upon the business perspective, as it's easy to just think about the consumer perspective with these things. So in terms of the services you offer, I couldn't help but notice that EV charging is also part of your offering. And I'm interested to hear your thoughts on how electric vehicles and EV charging mutually benefit each other, particularly because the average person doesn't tend to think about charging infrastructure anywhere near as much as the actual EV.
Yeah, great question. I mean, I do think that charging is absolutely critical. Of course, how are you going to fill up this vehicle? And there's well over 50% of the UK drivers can charge their vehicle at home. So actually, very naturally, if you're at home, it's again very similar to the mobile phone. You can plug in that car and it charges up overnight, and you start each day with a full charge. And so naturally, when we were trying to think about how do we make this as easy as possible for people to make that switch, we were thinking about, okay, well, it's not just about getting that car, but how do you get that charger at home? How do you get somebody that you trust to come and install it? What tech should you be getting? What chargers are good? How does that work? And actually, often consumers don't necessarily think about the next step, which is, and is that going to work and fit with my energy tariff so that I can get it charging at the right rates and really optimize that charging? So as an example, one of our energy tariffs has a 4-hour slot in the middle of the night, which is a third of the price of the rest of the day and a third of the price of kind of typical standard variable tariff in the UK. So it's much cheaper for people to charge up at that time. And that's when the infrastructure isn't being particularly used because everyone's asleep. So the grid, the national grid and the local grid, your energy system isn't being particularly used. So it's cheap from that perspective, as well as the fact that there might be, say, wind blowing in the middle of the night and people are asleep, so they aren't using that energy. So we offer that. We also offer a slightly more sophisticated tariff, which is a dynamic tariff called Agile. And so that tariff actually follows the wholesale market price. So it's typically inexpensive overnight. It's a small peak around at breakfast. It's relatively inexpensive in the middle of the day. And then there's often a big peak between 4 and 7 p.m. in terms of that price, which reflects the fact that we're having peak consumption here in the UK. So that's a time when we might be cooking tea or watching TV or whatever it is, or the kids get home from school and they're playing the Xbox, etc. That there's a big peak in electricity consumption at that point. So actually what we don't want to do during those peak times is for all the EV drivers to get home from work, plug in, and also start charging their car at that same time. So what we do is we want to shift that consumption to later on in the day when it's much cheaper and when it's greener, so that we can then have a much smarter energy system. And so we created these tariffs, and actually we really wanted charging to match those tariffs and to work alongside them, so that actually you end up with that charging solution, which is smart and clever as well. So, that tariff that I referred to that has the 4 cheap hours overnight, that starts at 12:30 at night. I don't want to have to go out to the car and plug in my car at 12:30 so I can start to make use of that tariff. I want the charger to do it for me. I want an app on my phone so I can just set it automatically to start at that time. So we started to look into that and how could we facilitate that? So actually we make our APIs available so that charging companies can connect with those APIs, and then they can sync up with the different tariffs. And in fact, we've seen them now syncing up with different energy companies' tariffs as well. So it's not just us. So there's a kind of industry emerging there, which will enable us to have a much smarter energy system. So that's part of it in terms of how could we make that simple and smooth, which is always not straightforward, but make sure that we can make it as easy as possible. And as you know, Ryan, of course, there's other bits. Then it's like, well, what about workplace charging? What about charging on the go? And particularly in charging on the go, in the UK, we have a very complicated setup, which I don't think you have in mainland Europe, where actually there's well more than 20 charging operators that historically have not been interoperable. So actually you might have to have an app for different charging operators. You might have to have a different card to be able to use some of the chargers, etc. And so at one point we had, customers with downloading, 10 to 15 apps onto their phone when they get their EV because they didn't know what charge point they might turn up to plug in next time. And so actually what we have done as well from an Octopus Energy perspective is we've created a single card where there's a number of different charge point operators now that have integrated with us so that we can have a single card, like you have much more so in mainland Europe, where you can use that single card to charge at a number of different operators. So Osprey, Charging, and a number of others in the UK, but also now Shell and New Motion have come on board too. So that's very exciting from that card, and that's called the Electric Juice Network.
Wow, there's a lot of really amazing stuff there. And I actually had no idea about the charge card that you offer. And it's actually really interesting timing in regards to the podcast, as a few episodes ago I was discussing in detail about charge cards and how they can be really complex with different networks. I'm glad to see your card will make life a lot easier for the consumer.
Yeah, and the great news as well is that, yeah, those cards you can use in mainland Europe now as well as in the UK for a number of these networks, which is also super helpful. So hopefully we will make it even easier. And it consolidates it onto a single bill, which people can then see their consumption all in one place.
Yeah, and I think this is all really important in transforming non-EV drivers to EV drivers, particularly with the ease of use of petrol stations, which is undisputed. I guess you could argue that the vast majority of EV drivers charge at home, so ultimately perhaps public charging isn't as crucial, but millions of people are still using public charging stations.
Yeah, and we do often get asked about people that can't charge at home. And I think this is going to be really interesting over the next few years to see where people that can't charge at home really take to charging. So Tesco, and a big retailer in the UK, as you know, have now installed a number of charge points that they're offering free charges at when people go shopping. And they've now hit over 500,000 charges that they've offered, given out to customers, which is fantastic. And so if you can fill up your car for free when you're shopping, that's really, it's a really interesting model for, people are anticipating that we're going to need all of these rapid chargers everywhere for those people who don't have off-street parking. But actually, because the cars are still in their parked for a number of hours, there's different routes in which they can fill up without having to go to those expensive rapid chargers. So I think it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out over the next few years. One of the other things which is quite exciting about one of those tariffs that I mentioned earlier, the agile tariff, the one that follows the wholesale market price. So literally the pricing comes out the day before. And what happens sometimes is that when the wind is blowing, if there's not enough demand on the grid, actually we will ask those wind turbines to turn off, for example. So we might pay their subsidy, but ask them not to generate electricity because there's not any demand for that electricity. And so we're like, this is crazy, right? Surely we should be paying our EV drivers to take that renewable energy at that time. And so actually what happens with the wholesale market price is the wholesale market price does go negative. And so our tariff, this agile tariff, also goes negative at those times. So actually, the May bank holiday last year, I think this is kind of the peak, where one customer, or the peak so far, I should say, one customer managed to charge up enough electricity into his car to go from London to Newcastle and back, which off the top of my head is, I think, about 400 miles for those that don't know UK geography. And they got paid the equivalent of £5 for the pleasure. So this is almost like you turning up to your petrol station, them giving you free petrol, enough to make that journey, and then saying, and here's a coffee and a donut to go with you. It's completely different mindset, compared to where we've been before.
Yeah, and I'm glad you touched upon the incentives of EV charging actually, because as you say, there are ways to minimize the cost as much as possible, which even existing EV drivers might not necessarily be aware of. I wanted to touch upon your Power Loop project, which is essentially your vehicle-to-grid innovation project. V2G has become one of the most exciting innovations in the EV space, and it's amazing to see that you're involved and actually offer free workshops as well.
Sure. So this is kind of taking that concept to the next stage. So what we talked about so far in terms of that smart energy system is obviously having off-peak times when we want to be using the grid to charge up our cars. But what we haven't said is, of course, now we've got a battery sitting in our driveways that isn't being fully utilized in terms of that driving. And actually, electricity historically has been expensive and difficult to store for long periods of time. So we have a bit of pump storage in the UK, for example, but actually taking it further than that has been challenging, and battery technology just for energy storage, for large-scale energy storage, has been expensive. But if it's already sitting there on your driveway, well, why don't we fill it up at that off-peak time in the middle of the night, whenever it might be, and then during those peak hours, why don't we use that green energy that we've stored in that car battery to support the grid and to support that local, the local homes and the local businesses? So that's exactly what vehicle to grid does. It charges up the car. It's vehicle to grid. Literally, it takes that energy from the vehicle and puts it back into the grid. Often it's used first initially by the home, so it will almost take the home off grid. So it will power the home, and then if there's surplus energy, it will then start to put that back into the grid that will help your neighbours, etc. And so what it requires is a bi-directional charger, a two-directional charger. So it's taking energy from the grid to the car, but it also takes it back from the car into the grid. And so we have got a project running, Power Loop, where there's 135 places on the project where we've got consumers taking vehicles, and actually it's a bundle. So they get a vehicle, a leased vehicle, they get the charger for free as part of that lease, and then they get a smart meter installed and they've got a tariff. And basically for plugging in at least 12 times a month during the peak time and then overnight, so that during the peak time so that we can discharge a bit to support the grid, but then overnight so we can fill it up again. So as long as they do that 12 times a month, we give them cash back of £30. So they're actually getting credited for the benefit of us being able to use their battery to create that smart energy system. And so that in itself is that bundle. And I think we're well over 100 now of those spots taken essentially on that trial. And we're supported by the government for this, Innovate UK, which is funded, I think, by the Department for Transport and Bays here in the UK. They have given a funding of about 3 million to be able to support us doing this, because those bi-directional chargers that I was talking about earlier, historically and still today, are very expensive. We've been running this and working on it for about 3 years now. We've seen the price more than half, which is fantastic. But obviously those prices need to continue to come down so that we can really create a long-term commercial proposition around this. And also part of it is what we're doing is, working on those chargers, but also working with the local grid operators so that we can realize some of that value and benefit for that consumer. So at the minute, it's quite theoretical because we haven't had these kind of services available before at this local level, at this home level. And so now we're working with those grid operators to really work out how it works and how we can offer those services back to them so that we can realize value for the grid and then give that back to the customer.
Well, I definitely recommend our listeners who are based in the UK and interested in participating to visit the Octopus Electric Vehicles website to find out more.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, we run workshops and that as well as other things that we're doing. So do feel free to come along and join the workshops and ask the team as well.
Great. And I wanted to dive into some quickfire questions to finish the conversation. This is quite a cliche question, but what is day-to-day life like as a CEO, particularly during the last 12 months where life has been flipped upside down?
Sure. So I got 2 kids. So my day-to-day often starts with getting my kids up and spending a bit of time with them before getting on the phone with the team and checking in terms of what we'll be doing that day, what the priority is, if there are any blockers that I can help them with. And then we'll typically have a couple of priorities that we're working on throughout that week and the next week, and things that we're looking to get launched or training to roll out, or specific areas where we're kind of deep diving to understand a bit more around what's happening for our consumers. And so it will just be then working with the team on those different areas. It's been a lot of fun. We used to do a lot of Zoom calls early on in lockdown, which was brilliant because we bonded hugely as a team. I think we had more and better communication than we'd ever had. But actually then as we kind of hit a kind of really nice rhythm, we've pulled back on a number of the Zoom calls and we do a lot more kind of local collaboration within the team, which has been fantastic. And I do get excited about the prospect of being able to work more frequently face-to-face with people. I like my whiteboards and the creativity. So looking forward to that coming back a bit more.
Perfect. And I definitely think there is something to be said about working in an office with the team. The next question is regarding the mass adoption of EVs and the most important step in making this a reality.
If you'd asked me this question about a year ago, I'd have said I'd really love to see the car manufacturers really get behind it, because I see the energy companies starting to change quite a lot. I've seen a lot in the charging space, a lot of chargers being rolled out, charger manufacturers doing huge, brilliant innovation. With car manufacturers, though, were being slow, and they might have launched a couple, but they weren't really getting behind it in terms of producing these units of volume. But actually, in the last year, I've seen a big shift there, and quite every week at the minute, we're hearing a new car manufacturer that's committing to go all electric by date X. And so this is fantastic. And so I think really, continuing to see more of that from the car manufacturers is really what we need to see, so that we can get these units out in volume on our roads. And the more that people see them, the more that people drive them, and the quicker we can get them, the better as well. Because some of our cars at the minute have 6-month lead times, for example. Whereas if there were more of them coming more quickly, then that would really help.
Yeah, and that leads perfectly onto my next question, actually, as I wanted to ask about what you'd say to automotive companies who are hesitant about making the transition to EVs.
I would say, don't have your Kodak moment. If you think about the camera industry, where Kodak did not quickly enough embrace digital technology and they got left behind, these car manufacturers need to make sure that they embrace EVs and don't get left behind.
Yeah, that's a pretty good analogy. What do you think is the biggest misconception about EVs?
The biggest misconception about electric vehicles is if you're going to run out of electricity.
I agree, and I think that's actually the most common answer I've had. So what other things do you do on a daily basis that you would consider sustainable?
I'm a real stickler for recycling. I don't know why, but I get really upset with myself if I don't. I can't really explain it. But the other things I love to do is I love cycling, and I particularly enjoy cycling or even scooting. I've got a scooter. So I cycle or scoot with my daughter to school, and that's one of my favorite things.
Yeah, I'm also a keen cyclist, and I think in a city like London, where the infrastructure is improving all the time, I definitely see more and more cyclists on the road than I ever have before. So what are you most looking forward to in 2021? That can be professionally, but also personally.
There's two things. One is, I think it's amazing how quickly, not just as a nation, but globally, we all changed our behaviors very, very quickly to meet a challenge, the COVID challenge. And we overnight completely changed the way that we lived across the board. And it was phenomenal. And we pulled together as communities to be able to do that and support each other throughout the whole of the last year. Well, that's been going on. And I think we as a nation and globally should take so much pride in what we've done. And how that leads into the rest of the year is, actually, as I look at the kind of climate challenge that we've got ahead of us, that's bigger than what we've already faced from COVID. And actually, we need to be able to pull together like that to be able to rise up and really fight against climate change. And it gives me a lot of hope to be able to see what we've been able to do and the confidence that we should take from that to be able to believe that we can make those changes so that we can, continue to live in the wonderful way that we've been privileged to live for so long.
I 100% agree with you. And whilst it's difficult to say that the last year has been a good one, there are definitely some positives to take. So the automotive industry isn't necessarily the most diverse, particularly when it comes to gender. And whilst we're seeing that changing with more and more diversity in companies, there is still a long way to go. So I wanted to ask about your perspective on this as a female CEO in the automotive industry.
Yeah, good question. I grew up with two brothers, and I did engineering at university, and I think I was 4% women in my engineering class at university. So I'm quite used to being in kind of male-dominated environments. But actually, where I am right now feels less male-dominated than any of those, because actually across Octopus Energy, there are a lot of really amazing female leaders. And also within my team, I'm lucky enough to have my direct leadership team is 50% female. And then across the rest of the broader team as well, there's some absolutely fantastic, more junior females that are coming through the ranks. And that's really exciting for us, to be able to see that talent. And, none of those people have been hired because they're female. They've definitely been hired because they were the right people for the jobs. And so that's super exciting. And I think, if anything, I'm lucky because people they enjoy working with a female CEO, is the feedback I've had. And I think because there aren't as many female CEOs around, I think I benefit because people enjoy that. And I've got a number that have come from, say, working in dealerships or other car manufacturers within the UK, where the feedback has been actually that they've had very male-dominated environments and they, haven't been respected for their brains. They've been treated on other criteria. And so actually it takes great pleasure for me. I get a lot of pleasure out of the fact that we can have an inclusive environment where people are really valued for what they contribute to the team and what they bring to the business, rather than say what they might look like and whether they're wearing enough makeup, which has been some of the feedback from other places.
That's really amazing to hear, and hopefully you inspire other women to follow a similar career path, as this is a great industry that people from all backgrounds should be interested in. I also think that the more diversity you have, the more perspectives and ideas you have too, which makes for a much more interesting dynamic in a business.
I completely agree on those points. Of course, as well, in cars, it's useful to remember that often women influence that decision making when it comes to what car to get. So actually, if there are people in a business and there aren't many women that are then, creating marketing materials or products and so forth, actually, to your point, they're missing opinions around that table, around that creative process that will really speak to their customer base as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. So my final question is one that I've started asking my recent guests, and it's whether there's one person or one thing that inspired you to have an interest for this industry.
My childhood and teenager years were very influential in terms of what's brought me here. And I think there's probably two big influences. One is, sadly, my dad had kidney failure when he was younger, and actually that had a big impact on us as a family. And what made me realize is that health is really important. And if you don't have your health, then actually your life can be curtailed and it can be more challenging. So therefore, there's a whole kind of drive there for me, which is like, how do I help people to live more healthily and better in themselves? And actually climate is just going to be challenging for all of us, climate change. So actually that's going to give us all a challenge on that one unless we deal with it. So that's a kind of really overarching theme. But then in terms of that individual, it probably goes back to that physics teacher. That physics teacher that was just kind of explaining how things were. And it just didn't make sense to me. And he kind of just very patiently talked me through it and talked me through some of the other options and what did exist, and kind of supported me when I was interested in learning more about it. So he was fantastic.
And I'm sure you'd love to tell him about how he inspired you today. So we finish every episode by asking our guest if there's anything they'd like to plug, be that something their company is working on or something they're just excited to see that's coming in the near future.
Yeah, so I think incentives to encourage the uptake of electric vehicles is really important. Low benefit in kind rates in the UK are making it, low company car tax rates in the UK are making it attractive for people to take cars on salary sacrifice or as business cars, for fleet, for company cars and so forth. Those kind of things, just tell everyone. Everyone should tell everyone, because it makes EVs super compelling and really exciting. And we learned that about 2/3 of the UK population don't realise, for example, that you can get your car on salary sacrifice. And actually, if they did, I think it would completely change the equation from a cost perspective for them to get that electric car and to switch to clean and green driving. So tell everyone, salary sacrifice, you can get your car from your business in return for a sacrifice of your gross salary, saving income tax and national insurance. And we've got customers saving, over £10,000 on a 3 or 4 year contract. So do spread the word. And, per the earlier conversation, the number one thing that's stopping people switching to electric cars at the minute and being put off is cost. So if we can spread the word, this will help people make that switch. And whether it's with us or someone else, they should set up that scheme and make it available to employees.
Perfect. Thanks for joining the podcast, Fiona.
Thanks very much. I really enjoyed it.
It was an absolute pleasure to welcome Fiona to the podcast to discuss Octopus Electric Vehicles, electric car leasing, and vehicle to grid. We'll be back for another episode soon. Revolution Conference 2021 is just 155 days away. Register today at revolutionconference.com.